Her car had died on the shoulder of Route 9 at 11 at night, hazard lights blinking into the dark, and when I pulled over to help, she looked at me like she'd already decided to refuse before I'd said a word. "I'm fine," she said, before I'd even gotten out of my truck. "I've got it handled." I looked at the hood, already up, smoke or steam or something unhelpful still drifting from the engine, and then at her, standing in the cold without a jacket, arms crossed against the night air, the specific posture of someone determined to manage a crisis entirely on her own, despite clear evidence that the crisis was not currently being managed. "You don't look like you've got it handled," I said. "I'm working on it." At 11 at night, on a stretch of road with no streetlights, in a sweater that isn't built for this temperature, she looked at me for a long moment, weighing whether the situation was bad enough to accept help from a stranger or whether pride could still win out. I'd seen that calculation before, in other people, in other circumstances. I recognized the exact moment pride lost. "The car overheated," she said finally. "I don't know enough about engines to know if that's fixable tonight or if I need a tow. Can I look?" "You don't have to." "I know, I'm offering anyway." She stepped back to let me examine the engine, and within a few minutes I'd confirmed what I'd suspected from the smell. A blown radiator hose, not an emergency exactly, but also not something fixable on the side of a dark road with whatever tools either of us happened to have. "You're going to need a tow," I said, "and probably a new hose. This isn't tonight's problem to solve. Not out here." She was quiet, looking at the disabled car with an expression that had shifted from frustration into something heavier. "Do you have somewhere to call?" I asked. "Someone who can come get you while you wait for the tow?" She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched longer than the question warranted, the specific pause of someone running through a mental list of options and finding it shorter than she wanted to admit. "Not really," she said finally. "Family, friends nearby?" "Not nearby. Not really anywhere, currently." Her voice had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when someone is admitting something they'd rather not have to say out loud to a stranger on a dark road. "I have nowhere left to go." The words landed with more weight than the sentence structure suggested they should. I looked at her, really looked, past the cold and the stranded car and the sweater that wasn't warm enough, and saw someone who'd clearly been managing more than a broken radiator hose for longer than tonight. "Then stay with me," I said. "Tonight, until you figure out the tow situation and wherever you actually need to be." She looked at me like the offer didn't compute. Like the math of a stranger's kindness didn't balance against whatever equation she'd been running in her head for however long this particular crisis had been building. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Caleb Hart. I live about 10 minutes from here. I have a spare room, no expectations attached, and considerably better heating than the side of this road." She was quiet for a long moment, the hazard lights still blinking against the dark, casting intermittent orange light across her face. "Avery," she said finally, "Avery Cross." "Okay, Avery. Here's what I'd suggest, so you're not just taking a stranger's word for it." I pulled out my phone. "Call someone, a friend, anyone. Send them my name, my address, my license plate, all of it. If you'd rather wait at the diner up the road or even the police station until the tow truck comes, I'll drive you there instead, and you can sort out the rest from somewhere public. I don't want you getting into a situation that feels unsafe just because the alternative was standing in the cold." Avery looked at me for a long moment, something in her expression shifting. Not quite trust yet, but the specific recalibration that happens when a stranger says exactly the thing a cautious person needs to hear. "That's a strange thing for someone with bad intentions to offer," she said. "That's sort of the point. I'd rather you feel safe and skeptical than unsafe and polite." She took a photo of my license plate, texted it along with my name to someone, a friend, she mentioned, currently 3 states away but reachable, and waited for a response before saying anything further. "Okay," she said, once the friend had texted back some version of approval. "Let's call the tow truck, and then let's get you somewhere warm." She nodded, the specific, exhausted relief of someone who'd been holding herself together through sheer will and had just been given permission, however briefly, to stop. We called the tow company from my truck, heater running, and waited the 20 minutes it took for them to arrive in a silence that felt less awkward than it probably should have, given that we were strangers. "This is a strange way to meet someone," she said, eventually breaking the quiet. "Most ways people meet are strange, if you look at them closely enough. This one's just more obviously strange than most." She almost laughed. The almost laugh of someone too tired and too overwhelmed to fully commit to finding something funny, but registering it anyway. "My name is Caleb Hart. I'm 33 years old. I run a small contracting business out of a town called Millbrook, the kind of work that's steady without being exciting, fixing other people's houses while my own stayed simple and mostly unremarkable. I'd been divorced for 2 years, amicably, the kind of ending that doesn't leave much wreckage, but also doesn't leave much behind it, just a quiet house and a routine that had calcified into something comfortable enough not to examine too closely. I learned over the course of that first night and the days that followed that Avery Cross had lost her job 6 weeks earlier, a marketing position at a company that had done layoffs without much warning, and had fallen behind on rent within a month. The specific speed with which one piece of bad luck compounds into several more if you don't have much margin to begin with. She'd been couch surfing between 2 friends' places for the past 2 weeks, increasingly aware that she was wearing out a welcome neither friend had explicitly withdrawn, but both had started subtly signaling through small comments and tired expressions. That night, she'd been driving to a third option, an old coworker who'd offered, somewhat reluctantly, a guest room for a few nights, when the car had died on Route 9, the final straw in a sequence of straws that had been accumulating for over a month. "I didn't want to call my parents," she told me that first night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. "They'd help. I know they would, but they'd also make it about every choice I've ever made that led to this point, and I genuinely cannot handle that conversation on top of everything else right now." "That's fair," I said. "Sometimes help comes with too much commentary attached." "Exactly. I'd rather sleep in my car than sit through the specific disappointment my mother does so well." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "This is humiliating, by the way. Accepting help from a stranger on the side of a road. I want you to know I'm aware of how this looks. It looks like someone having a hard month who needed a tow truck and a warm room. That's not humiliating, that's just Tuesday for most people, eventually." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read yet. Gratitude mixed with something more guarded. The specific caution of someone who'd learned not to trust kindness until it had proven itself over time. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping. Most people wouldn't have." "Most people would have. You just got unlucky with timing on an empty road." "I don't think that's true, but I appreciate you saying it." She looked around my kitchen for the first time with something other than crisis management focus, taking in the worn cabinets, the single coffee mug drying on the rack, the specific quiet evidence of someone who lived alone and had for a while. "You live here by yourself?" she asked. "Divorced, 2 years now. Amicable, if that matters. No kids, no big dramatic ending, just 2 people who realized they wanted different versions of the same life." I refilled her tea, though she still hadn't touched the first cup. "It's a quiet house. I don't mind quiet most days." "Most days?" "Some days the quiet gets a little loud, if that makes sense. But mostly I've made peace with it." I sat down across from her. "What about you? Before all this? What does Avery Cross do when her life isn't actively falling apart? Marketing. Was marketing, past tense, until 6 weeks ago." She wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. "I was good at it. Genuinely good, not just adequate. The layoff wasn't about performance. It was budget cuts, the whole department gone in one afternoon meeting that lasted maybe 10 minutes for something that had taken me 3 years to build. That's a hard way to lose something you were good at." It was. I keep waiting for it to feel less personal, the fact that it wasn't about me specifically. It still feels entirely about me, somehow, even though I know intellectually it wasn't. We talked for another hour that first night, the conversation moving slowly from the practical details of her situation into something more like an actual exchange between 2 people getting to know each other. despite the strange circumstances of how the evening had started. "I should probably let you sleep," I said, eventually, noticing the hour. "Spare rooms down the hall, second door. Towels are in the closet if you want to shower." "Thank you, Caleb. Genuinely. I know I keep saying that, but I mean it more each time. You don't have to keep thanking me. One thank you covers the whole night. I'm working on believing that too." She stayed the first night in my spare room, intending, she told me clearly, to figure out alternative arrangements within a day or two. The tow truck took her car to a shop in town, the radiator hose replacement scheduled for later in the week once the part arrived. In the meantime, she had no car, limited options, and a pride that made every offer of continued help feel like a negotiation she was reluctant to enter into. "I can sleep on the couch starting tomorrow," she said the second morning, before I'd even finished my coffee. "You shouldn't have to give up your spare room indefinitely for someone you met on the side of a road." "The spare room is fine. I don't use it for anything except storing things I should probably donate." "That's generous, but it's also not really the point. I don't want to become an obligation." I looked at her across the kitchen. This woman who'd spent 2 nights in my house and had apparently spent every one of them calculating exactly how much space she was allowed to take up before it became too much. "You're not an obligation," I said. "You're a person who had a hard month and needs somewhere stable while you figure out next steps. There's a difference." "Is there, practically?" "Practically, yes. An obligation is something you resent." "I don't resent this." I held her gaze. "Stay until the car's fixed. Stay longer if you need to figure out the rest. I'm not running a tight schedule here." She was quiet, processing this with the same careful attention she seemed to bring to most decisions, weighing the offer against whatever internal ledger she kept of debts and burdens. "Okay," she said finally, "until the car's fixed. We can reassess after that." "Reasonable, reassess away." She started the list on the third night, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad she'd found in a drawer, writing in the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone working through a problem methodically rather than emotionally. I noticed it because she'd left it on the table when she went to bed, and I'd glanced at it while clearing the dishes, not snooping exactly, just unable to avoid seeing the heading at the top, written in capital letters, "Things I need to rebuild." Below it, a numbered list: find a job, save enough for a deposit, stop being afraid to call my parents if I actually need them, figure out what I actually want instead of just reacting to what went wrong. I left it alone. Didn't mention I'd seen it, but something about the specific honesty of that fourth item stayed with me longer than the others. She brought it up herself a few days later, catching me looking at the legal pad on the counter. "You've seen the list," she said. Not accusatory, just observant. "I have. I wasn't trying to read it. It was just there." "It's fine. I'm not embarrassed about it, exactly. It's just strange, having someone else potentially see how unsorted I currently am." She picked up the pad, looking at her own handwriting like she was reading it freshly. "I make lists when things feel out of control. It's how I process, breaking the big scary problem into smaller, manageable pieces. Does it help? Sometimes. Mostly it helps me feel like I'm doing something instead of just absorbing whatever's happening to me." By that point, a rhythm had developed between us that neither of us had explicitly planned. She'd taken over breakfast most mornings, the specific domestic gesture of someone who'd decided contributing something, even something small, mattered to her sense of balance. I'd started leaving for work slightly later, so we could have coffee together before I left. A change in routine I hadn't examined too closely until Marcus pointed it out weeks later. She applied for 6 jobs that first week, methodically, treating the search with the same organized determination she brought to the list itself. 3 rejections came back within days. The silence from the other 3 stretched longer, the specific anxious waiting that comes with not knowing whether silence means consideration or simply being forgotten. "I hate this part," she admitted, on the 4th day, staring at her laptop screen with the particular exhaustion of someone managing hope and disappointment in alternating shifts. "The waiting. I'd rather get rejected immediately than sit in this in-between space not knowing. For what it's worth, the silence doesn't mean no. It usually just means slow. I know that logically. Emotionally, silence still feels like rejection wearing a disguise. That's fair. I don't think I can fix that feeling. I can just keep reminding you it's not necessarily true. She looked at me with something like gratitude that didn't require words, and went back to refreshing her email for the third time that hour. She set the pad down. I added something today, can I show you? She turned the page to a new item, added below the original 4. Stop assuming kindness always has a hidden cost. I looked at it for a long moment. That's a good addition, I said. It's aspirational. I'm still working on actually believing it. She looked at me. You've been kind for almost a week now without asking for anything. I keep waiting for the catch and there hasn't been one, and I genuinely don't know what to do with that information yet. There's no catch coming, Avery. I know. I'm working on believing that too. On the 5th night, Avery insisted on cooking dinner, framing it as repayment for a week of hospitality despite my repeated insistence that no repayment was necessary. I need to do something useful, she said, already moving through my kitchen with the confidence of someone who actually knew how to cook, unlike my own fairly basic repertoire. Let me have this. It's good for my morale. I'm not going to argue with someone determined to make me dinner. Smart man. She made something with chicken and a sauce I couldn't identify, but immediately wanted the recipe for. Moving through the unfamiliar kitchen with the specific efficiency of someone who found cooking genuinely calming rather than stressful. Where'd you learn to cook like this? I asked, she'd watching her work. My grandmother. She basically raised me on weekends while my parents worked, and cooking was sort of our shared language. She didn't talk much about feelings directly, but she'd teach me a new recipe every visit, and somehow that always felt like the actual conversation underneath the conversation. She plated the food with the same care she'd put into making it. She passed 3 years ago. I don't cook as much as I should, given how much it meant to her that I learned. This is sort of nice, actually, having a reason to do it again. I'm glad I could provide the reason, even accidentally. Most good things happen accidentally in my experience. This whole week has been one accident after another, and somehow it's turned out better than most things I've planned carefully. We ate at the kitchen table, the conversation easier than it had been even the previous nights. The specific comfort that develops once two people stop treating every interaction as requiring careful management. The car got fixed on day 6, and the conversation about what came next happened that same evening, both of us aware that the original arrangement, stay until the car's fixed, had reached its stated expiration point. I have somewhere to stay, Avery said over dinner. The co-worker's offer is still open. I called her today. Is that what you want, or just what's available? She set down her fork, considering the question with more weight than I'd expected. Honestly, I don't know. The co-worker's place is fine. It's not... She paused, searching for the right framing. It doesn't feel like this does. This past week has felt different than couch surfing usually feels. Less like I'm borrowing space, and more like I'm actually allowed to exist somewhere without earning it constantly. You're allowed to exist here too, if that's relevant information. It's relevant. She looked at me carefully. Are you offering that, or am I reading into something that isn't actually being offered? I'm offering it, clearly this time, since apparently I haven't been clear enough about it so far. She studied me for a long moment, the specific assessment of someone who'd learned to distrust easy answers and was checking this one for hidden fault lines. I need you to understand something about me, she said. I don't take things at face value easily. Not anymore. I used to. I lost that ability somewhere between the layoff and the couch surfing, and I haven't quite gotten it back yet. I understand that. I'm not asking you to trust this instantly. I'm just telling you the offer is real, and you can take whatever time you need to believe it. That's a generous amount of patience to extend to someone you met 6 days ago on the side of a road. Maybe. Or maybe 6 days is plenty of time to recognize someone worth being patient for. She was quiet for a long moment, something working behind her expression that I'd started learning to read over the past week. The specific process of someone recalculating an internal ledger that had been running too long on suspicion of other people's motives. Okay, she said finally. I'll stay. For now, we can keep reassessing as we go. Reasonable. I'm becoming quite fond of reassessing. Marcus, my closest friend since high school, came by for dinner about 3 weeks into Avery's extended stay, the kind of casual visit that had become less casual once he realized the living arrangement had developed into something with more permanence than either Avery or I had explicitly named yet. We ended up on the back porch after dinner, beers in hand, while Avery cleaned up inside, and Marcus wasted no time getting to the point he'd clearly been building toward all evening. "Caleb, here we go. I'm serious. We need to talk about this." He gestured vaguely toward the house. "Her. This. Whatever this currently is. It's a woman who needed help and is currently figuring out her next steps. That's what this is. 3 weeks, man. That's not a few nights of emergency shelter. That's a living arrangement that's developed its own gravity." Marcus took a drink, studying me with the specific directness 25 years of friendship had earned him the right to use. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Not the careful version you've been giving everyone else who's asked about this. Ask, do you actually know if she's going to run the second she has a real option? Or do you want her to stay, regardless of whether she ever really needs to?" The question landed harder than I'd expected, sitting on a porch with a beer going warm in my hand. "I don't know," I admitted. "Honestly, I haven't let myself examine that directly." Why not? Because if the answer is that I want her to stay regardless of necessity, that changes what this is. It stops being generosity and starts being something with stakes attached. And she's had enough stakes attached to things lately. I didn't want to add to that pile without being sure. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing this with more seriousness than his opening question had suggested he might bring. "That's actually a thoughtful concern," he admitted. "More thoughtful than I expected, given how oblivious you usually are about this stuff." Thanks, I think. But here's the thing, Caleb. You can be careful about timing, sure, but at some point, careful starts looking a lot like avoidance, and she spent her whole adult life apparently assuming kindness has a hidden cost. If you're sitting on real feelings and dressing them up as patient generosity, that's its own kind of hidden cost. Just a slower one. I sat with that for a long moment, the porch quiet except for the sounds of Avery moving around in the kitchen inside. The specific domestic comfort of someone who'd started, slowly, to feel like she belonged in this particular house. "When did you get wise?" I asked. "I've always been wise. You've just been too distracted to notice." Marcus took another drink, settling back into the porch chair rather than leaving yet, apparently not finished with the conversation. "Can I tell you what I actually think is happening here since we're being honest tonight?" "Go ahead." "I think you've spent 2 years since the divorce telling yourself you're fine being alone. Comfortable house, steady routine, no complications. And I think some part of you liked it that way because it was safe. Nothing to lose if nothing's really invested." He looked at me directly. Then a woman with nowhere to go shows up on the side of a road, and suddenly you're rearranging your work schedule and learning her coffee order and not mentioning any of this to me for 3 weeks, which, frankly, hurt my feelings slightly. I wasn't hiding it from you specifically. You were hiding it from yourself, mostly, which had the side effect of hiding it from me, too. Same result. He gestured toward the house again. "She's good for you, man. I can see it just from one dinner. You laugh differently than you did even 6 months ago. That's not nothing. I noticed that too, actually, the laughing differently part. Good. Acknowledge it. Then do something useful with the acknowledgement instead of just filing it away the way you file away most feelings. That's a low blow. It's an accurate blow. We've established those aren't mutually exclusive, you and me, over 25 years of friendship." Marcus stood, finally, stretching properly this time. "Figure out what you actually want, man. Soon. Before the not knowing becomes its own kind of answer she has to interpret without your help." Avery had an interview scheduled that same week, the first one that had actually responded with genuine interest, rather than silence or rejection. And the morning of it she was visibly nervous in a way I hadn't seen from her since that first night on the road. "You're going to be fine," I told her, watching her go through her interview outfit options for the 3rd time. "You're good at this. You said so yourself. Being good at the job and being good at convincing someone to give me the job are different skills. I've always been better at the actual work than the performance of getting hired to do it. Then don't perform. Just tell them what you told me about the marketing campaign you built before the layoffs. That wasn't a performance. That was just you being genuinely good at something. She looked at me, something settling slightly in her nervous energy. That's actually helpful advice. I have my moments. She got the call back that evening, not the job itself yet, but a second interview. The specific relief of forward momentum after weeks of silence and rejection. She came home practically vibrating with the news, and without fully thinking about it, I pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than a simple congratulations probably required. "This is good," she said into my shoulder, not pulling away. "This is really good, Caleb." "It is. I'm proud of you." She looked up at me then, something passing between us that neither of us named directly, but that sat in the room afterward with a weight I couldn't ignore for the rest of that week. I thought about Marcus's question for the better part of a week, turning it over during work, during the quiet evenings that had become routine, during the specific moments when Avery would laugh at something and I'd catch myself thinking, I don't want this to be temporary. The realization, when it finally settled into something I trusted enough to act on, happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing about the day suggesting it would become significant. Avery was at the kitchen table with her legal pad, the list having grown considerably over the weeks, most of the early items checked off, a job interview scheduled for the following week, the deposit savings slowly accumulating in a separate account she'd started. "Can I see the list?" I asked, nodding at the pad. She looked up, surprised by the direct request after weeks of me carefully not asking. "Sure." I read through it, the original 5 items, several new additions, most checked off in the satisfying way that comes from actually making progress on something that once felt insurmountable. Near the bottom, a recent addition I hadn't seen before. Figure out what's actually happening with Caleb instead of assuming it has an expiration date. I looked up at her. That's a fairly direct item for someone who told me she processes things by making lists instead of saying them out loud. Avery's expression did something complicated, caught, then something more vulnerable underneath the caught part. "I was going to bring it up eventually," she said. "I just wanted to have the rest of my life slightly more sorted first. It felt unfair to ask you what this was while I was still technically a person with no job and no apartment. I don't think those things are connected the way you're imagining. They feel connected to me. I didn't want you to feel obligated to define this just because I'm currently dependent on your spare room." I thought about the past few weeks, the dinners that had stopped feeling like obligation and started feeling like the actual best part of most days. The way her laugh had become something I listened for, the specific comfort of a house that had gone from quiet by necessity to quiet by choice, full in a way I hadn't fully registered until considering its absence. I crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her, the legal pad between us. 3 weeks of careful list-making laid out in her handwriting. "Avery, I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it instead of immediately calculating what it costs you to accept it." She set down her pen, giving me her full attention. "I don't want this to have an expiration date either," I said. "I haven't wanted that for a while now. I've been careful about saying so because I didn't want you to feel like staying came with strings attached, like the kindness had a hidden cost after all, exactly the thing you've been afraid of since that first night on the road." But my friend Marcus pointed out fairly bluntly that being careful about timing eventually starts looking like its own kind of dishonesty. Avery was quiet, processing this with the same careful attention she brought to most things. "So, what are you actually saying?" she asked. "I'm saying I don't want you to find an apartment and move out and become someone I used to know. I'm saying the version of this where you stay isn't generosity anymore, if it ever fully was. It's something I want, specifically, regardless of whether you technically need somewhere to stay." I held her gaze, making sure the next part landed clearly. "Marcus asked me a question a few days ago. Whether I knew if you were going to run the second you had a real option, or whether I wanted you to stay regardless. I didn't have an honest answer at the time. I have one now." "What's the honest answer?" I want you to stay regardless, not because you need to. Because I want you here. That's the actual truth I've been avoiding saying clearly, dressed up as patience. She looked at the legal pad between them, at her own handwriting working through the rebuild of an entire life, and then at me. I added that item 3 days ago, she said. I've been trying to figure out how to bring it up without sounding like I was trying to manufacture permanence out of a temporary arrangement. You don't have to manufacture anything, I'm telling you directly. She picked up her pen again, and for a moment I thought she was going to write something else on the list. Instead, she crossed out the most recent item, figure out what's actually happening with Caleb, and wrote something new beneath it. She turned the pad toward me so I could read it. Stop assuming this is temporary. It isn't. Is that accurate? She asked us. Completely accurate. Avery's car never fully left my driveway after that, in the sense that she stopped treating her presence in the house as something requiring constant justification. The legal pad stayed on the kitchen counter, the list continuing to grow and shrink as items got checked off and new ones got added, no longer just about rebuilding what had broken, but about building something new entirely. She got the job within the month, a marketing position with a local company that valued exactly the skills her previous employer had apparently failed to appreciate. The deposit savings kept growing too, steadily, and by month 4, she had enough saved for a place of her own, an actual viable option sitting in her bank account rather than a hypothetical. She showed me the number on her banking app one evening, somewhat sheepishly, like she wasn't sure how I'd react to evidence that she finally had a real choice. I could afford my own place now, she said, if I wanted that. Do you want that? She considered the question with the same careful weight she gave most decisions. No, she said finally. I looked at a few listings last week, actually, just to see. None of them felt like anywhere I wanted to be. This already does. Then don't go looking for reasons to leave something that's already working. I'm not. I just wanted you to know I'm choosing this. Not because I have no other option anymore. Because I looked at the other option and it wasn't what I wanted. That distinction mattered to both of us more than either of us said directly at the time. The difference between staying out of necessity and staying because the alternative, now genuinely available, simply didn't compare. She kept contributing to the savings account anyway, for the next several months, not toward an apartment anymore, but toward nothing specific. Just the quiet security of having options even when she wasn't using them. Having a financial cushion feels like its own kind of stability, she told me once, regardless of what else is going on. 1 year after that first night on Route 9, I found the original legal pad in a drawer while looking for something else. The early entries faded slightly but still legible. I brought it to her at the kitchen table, where she was working through a current list for an entirely different project, wedding planning. 3 months into an engagement neither of us had rushed into. But both of us had arrived at with the specific certainty that comes from building something slowly enough to trust it, over a full year rather than a few impulsive weeks. Look what I found, I said, setting the old pad down beside her current one. She picked it up, reading through the early entries with the specific fondness of someone looking at evidence of how far they'd come. Find a job, she read aloud. Save enough for a deposit. Stop being afraid to call my parents. She looked up. I did call them, eventually, about a month after I moved in here properly. They were surprised, but not in the way I'd dreaded. Mostly just glad I was somewhere safe. I remember. You were nervous about that call for 2 days beforehand. I was nervous about a lot of things, for longer than I probably needed to be. She turned to the later pages, to the item about kindness and hidden costs, to the final entry about this not being temporary. I kept thinking something would eventually go wrong, that the catch would show up late, the way bad news sometimes does. Did it? No. She looked at me, something settled and certain in her expression that hadn't been there that first cold night on the side of Route 9. No catch. Just you, consistently, for longer than I initially believed was possible. I sat down across from her, the 2 legal pads side by side, one chronicling a rebuild from nothing, the other chronicling a wedding neither of us had expected 6 months ago to be planning so soon. For what it's worth, I said, Stopping that night on Route 9 is still the best impulsive decision I've ever made. For what it's worth, Avery said, accepting the help is still the hardest thing I've ever done. Harder than the job hunt, harder than calling my parents, just letting someone help without immediately calculating the cost. How'd that work out? She looked at the ring on her hand, then at me, then at 6 months of evidence that kindness, sometimes, really didn't come with hidden costs attached. Pretty well, actually, she said. Better than I let myself hope for that first night. Marcus came by again that same month, the engagement still recent enough that he hadn't stopped bringing it up at every opportunity. I take full credit, he announced, settling onto the same porch chair he'd occupied months earlier during the conversation that had apparently changed everything. That porch conversation. That was the turning point. You can both thank me at the wedding. You asked one pointed question, I said. I did the actual work of figuring out the answer. Sure, but someone had to ask the question. That's the hard part. Anyone can have feelings. Not everyone has a friend brave enough to call them out on a porch with mediocre beer. The beer wasn't mediocre. It was a little mediocre. That's beside the point. Marcus looked between us with genuine warmth underneath the usual joking. I'm happy for you two. Genuinely. I don't say that kind of thing often, so take it seriously when I do. We're taking it seriously, Avery said. Thank you, Marcus. For the question, mediocre beer and all. See, she gets it. This is why I like her. After Marcus left, Avery and I stayed on the porch a while longer, the late afternoon light doing what it does in early autumn, slow and golden and unhurried. Do you remember exactly what you said? She asked. That first night, on the road. Then stay with me. I remember it clearly. I think about it more often than I probably should. I think about it constantly, she admitted. I've replayed it so many times. The way you said it like it wasn't even a question, just an obvious next step. She looked at me. Say it again. Right now. I want to hear what it sounds like when it's not about a broken down car or having nowhere else to go. I took her hand, the ring catching the late light between us. Then stay with me, I said. Not because you have nowhere else to go, because I can't imagine the version of my life where you're not in this house, in this kitchen, leaving lists on my counter that I read when you're not looking. She smiled, the full one, unguarded in a way that had taken months to fully arrive. That's a much better reason, she said. I'll take it. I thought about a stranded car on Route 9 and a sweater that wasn't warm enough, and a sentence that had sounded, that first night, like the end of something. It had turned out to be the beginning instead. What would you have done if you found a stranger stranded on the side of the road with nowhere left to go and something told you to offer more than just a ride? Have you ever discovered that the kindness you offered without expecting anything back turned out to be the beginning of everything that mattered most? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.